Now to session 2, 1 year into the Biden administration. As a reminder, our program with full speaker bios is on our website. It's also in the chat box for your convenience. If you have questions for any of our speakers at any time, type them in the Q&A box and we're going to get to as many of them as possible. We do want to hear from you and we do want this to be as interactive as possible. For session 2, we have Ira Kasoff from APCO and our Southern California Center moderating with speakers Wendy Cutler, Deborah Lehr, and Anja Manuel. Ira.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be moderating this panel with 3 outstanding speakers, each of whom I've had the chance to work with at various points in my own career. So as you just heard from Margaret, our topic is 1 year into the Biden administration, to assess the current state of play between the US and China, review the administration's strategic priorities, and discuss the strategic framework going forward. So let me begin by briefly introducing our speakers, and as you've heard, full bios are available through the website. Wendy Cutler is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and Managing Director of its Washington, D.C. office. She joined ASPI following an illustrious career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Deborah Lehr serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Edelman Global Advisory and is the Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. Deborah previously built and managed 3 successful consulting businesses, representing diverse Western and Chinese companies such as Sesame Workshop, Tory Burch, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Pfizer, Sony Music, Time Warner, and Boeing. Anja Manuel is co-founder and principal at Rice, Hadley, Gates & Manuel LLC. She is a former diplomat, an author, and advisor on emerging markets. Her book, This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States, was published in 2016. So let's get started. Our great former ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, was famous for saying to visitors, the US-Japan relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. Well, I think it's safe to say that today, the US-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. So I'd like to begin by asking each of our speakers to take a few minutes to share your thoughts on the Biden administration's policies towards China. What have we gotten right so far and what wrong? Does the administration actually have a China strategy? So maybe Wendy, you can kick it off.
Well, sure. Thank you so much, Ira, and thanks to the Margaret and her team at the Asia Society North California Center. It's really an honor to be in the opening panel for such a great program today. So yeah, we're just about a year into the Biden administration, and it's always a good time to kind of reflect what we've seen over the past year and what we might see looking ahead. And I think Kevin Rudd has touched upon many of these themes already. I mean, my assessment is that the Biden administration has done a reasonably good job on US-China relations, particularly in light of the cards it was dealt. So it was dealt with basically a very competitive and tension-full relationship. It was dealt a hand with a lot of tariffs and export controls and sanctions in place. And it was dealt a hand with Congress looking to the administration to be tough and looking for any hint of any softness. So I think on the latter point, the Biden administration has kind of quelled any concerns that Biden would get soft on China. The Biden team has reinstituted, I'd say, a very deliberate and organized policy deliberation process, which has resulted, I think, in more thoughtful US-China trade policy. And I think the Biden administration has taken a very realistic view on China. I think they have a good sense of China's intentions and capabilities, and also what the US can change or influence in China and what it simply can't. So that's how to answer the first part of your question. And just basically, just a few thoughts on what they've gotten right and maybe what they've gotten wrong or could do better. The first would be what they've gotten right. And here I would just echo what my boss, Kevin Rudd, just said. I think focusing on rebuilding strength and competitiveness and power at home is key. And Biden has gotten through some important legislation through the Congress, including the recent infrastructure bill. Second, I think the Biden administration has done an amazing job with our allies and partners so far, not only rebuilding those relationships, but now working with them on an affirmative agenda to kind of present, to shape an agenda which is based on our values and our norms. And also, let's be honest, on organizing with our allies and partners in different groupings to contest and to complain and to express concern about different Chinese policies, whether it be Taiwan, Xinjiang, or Hong Kong. And finally, I think the administration has done a good job focusing on the US's potential vulnerabilities and overdependence on China through a lot of its supply chain work that's been underway for over the past year. And let me conclude with just two areas where maybe they could do better. Or the first would be, I think it's taken way too long for the administration to put forward their economic vision for engagement with Asia Pacific countries. And we'll get to that later. I think we're going to be seeing that soon. But it's a year into the administration. China has taken advantage of that absence of the US and that gap, and just over the past few months has expressed its formal interest in joining the CPTPP, in joining the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, and concluding with 14 other Asian countries, the RCEP agreement. And finally, I would just say, I think the other thing, maybe what they would do a little differently is they put a lot of onus and a lot of attention on the so-called China review. And at least for the first few months, you kept hearing, well, we can't answer that question. We're looking at it in our China review. And I think they set high expectations for the outcome of this review. And it's basically a year later, some of us have stopped asking about it, but it typically comes up in conferences like this. And frankly, I cannot answer that question. I keep hearing it's almost done. Oh, back to you, Ira.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you've touched on a lot of topics that we want to get into during the course of our discussion. One quick comment, if I could. I think one of the reasons why they've moved slowly on some of that is that they've been really scared, maybe, or scared is not the right word, but they don't want to distract from their priorities during the first year, getting the COVID relief bill through, getting the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better. So they didn't want to give ammunition to anyone on China that could distract from their priorities, I think. Okay, so thanks very much for that opening. Deborah, maybe I could ask you the same questions.
Great. Well, again, let me echo Wendy and saying many thanks to the Asia Society for hosting this, because obviously at the end of the first year, it is a good time to take stock. And it's wonderful to be on stage, so to speak, with so many old friends. And Wendy and I work together at USTR and even at the Commerce Department, if we can think back that far. And as usual, I agree with everything that Wendy has had to say. I think she has really laid out a very articulate framework for the issues facing the administration, for what they are doing right, and for some of the challenges that we see in the China world for maybe what they could be doing better. So let me present a slightly different aspect of this. For the last 22 years, Edelman has issued a trust barometer across now 28 countries, including the US and China. And these interviews are to gauge trust by citizens in these countries and their institutions, in government, NGOs, business, and the media. And we're going to issue the findings next week, but I wanted to preview some of the results because they actually are quite relevant to the discussion that we're having today. Now, of course, anyone who's worked in China knows that accurate numbers can sometimes be difficult to come by. And so we're looking very much what the trends have been as well. But it's very interesting. So in China, as we look across the people who've been surveyed in those countries and their trust in those four institutions, in China, it's an all-time high of 83%. Contrast it with the United States, it's 43%, a 40% difference of confidence and trust in those institutions. Also in China, of the four of them, the government was ranked the highest at 91%. In the US, it's actually business that's ranked the highest, but that's even still under 50%. It's 49, just touching there. For government and media, it's 39%. And in the US, there's an overwhelming expectation from the people who were surveyed that business step into this gap now, this lack of trust around media and government. The business has shown that they have been heroes during COVID, that they are the ones who have been able to produce and deliver vaccines, that they have been the ones of getting the economy back on track, and therefore government should be filling this void. So why is this relevant in the discussion that we're having today? Well, as we look at what is coming out of the administration, and as Wendy has said, we still haven't seen the China review, but we certainly hear a lot of hints, and we've seen some elements of it, and we still hear the very strong language that we had heard very similar in the Trump administration. Clearly, we need to protect our national security. We're continuing to sanction companies that we feel have violations for national security or human rights reasons. We are maintaining the tariffs. We tend to have a very tough national security stance, and the actions we've seen so far follow that. But if you look at what's happening on the ground with business, it's a very different story. US exports are up to China. US investment is up in China. Companies are profitable in China. When asked, companies are changing their supply chains more because of COVID than because of the tensions between China. And we could even say we're more recoupling than decoupling. And so how is this relevant in this context? Well, with this discrepancy between confidence in government and confidence in business in the United States, perhaps there is an opportunity for business to have a stronger voice in this debate than previously believed. And business has not been a large part of the discussions that have been taking place with the administration. And there isn't really a strong business component within the administration. The person who probably has the most experience in business is Secretary Raimondo. And so making sure that that voice is heard, I think, is very important, because there's going to have to be a reconciliation between these very strong national security positions who view essentially any business with China is almost a violation of American patriotism, and then what's actually happening with the business community. One last kind of interesting statistic that came out of the survey as well, and that's about perceptions abroad of Chinese companies and American companies. Overseas, Chinese companies are viewed with about 31% trust, yet for American companies, it's over 50% at 53%. This idea of them being heroes still is continued overseas. So let me conclude there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. That's great. I was particularly interested in your comments about the U.S. business role. Traditionally, U.S. business has had a very active role. If you think back to the days of PNTR, permanent normal trade relations, and WTO accession and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see whether that can be revived going forward. So Anja, maybe you can take a few minutes to give us your thoughts.
Yeah, let me just pick up where Deborah left off. And it's so nice to be on virtual stage with the three of you. I wish we were in person. It's been too long since we've all seen each other. I'll just pick up where Deborah left off. There is an enormous disconnect between the US business and policy communities on China. When we talk to American business leaders, we hear unless they're in tech, which we'll get to, the financial institutions want to triple their exposure to China. Goldman Sachs was just cleared to take full control of their Chinese securities business. The American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai reports confidence among its members, even in spite of COVID and the trade war. But that's not what we see in Washington. Xi Jinping has done the impossible. He's unified Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. Everyone I talk to on the Hill is uniformly hawkish, whether on the right or on the left. So we can say a lot about Biden's strategy towards China, but they're really hampered by the fact that US opinion has turned so strongly, and especially congressional opinion has turned so strongly against China, and hampered by the fact that they don't really have an open hand from Xi Jinping for all of the reasons that Kevin discussed in the first session. So here's where I think we are. Secretary Blinken laid out very early in his tenure the compete, collaborate, confront model with the US respect to China. The idea would be We're going to collaborate on the issues that we can still agree on, forefront climate change. We're going to compete where we must, and we'll confront where necessary. 1 year in, how's that going? I would say not so well. And I'm not blaming the Biden administration here. It's just the international system hasn't been open to these things working. So on collaborate, Kerry's really at the forefront of this. Xi Jinping is surrounded by people telling him that the United States is in terminal decline. And the Chinese have essentially said, no, we're not going to collaborate with you on some things unless you help us solve some of the other issues. So at COP26, Secretary Kerry bent over backwards to try to get the Chinese into a deal. I think that deal did very little. The Chinese committed to very little, but it gave them the opportunity to save face and not be seen as the bad guys at COP26. So we're not getting much on the collaborate front. On the compete side, Wendy already talked about the really important bills that the United States has passed. We keep focusing on the ones that haven't passed, but boy, a lot was done legislatively last year, and that's positive. All of those things we need to do to get the United States economy and society shored up for what might be a long competition. And I would say, Wendy, just to follow up from what you said, yes, the infrastructure bill is great and it's important. Now we really have to get through USICA and some of the bills on technology that will really shore up the technology race with China. And I know we'll get to that later in the discussion. And then finally, on the confront side, we haven't talked about this very much yet, but this is a very dangerous time on the military side between US and China relations. And again, here, I would put most of the blame on the Chinese side. Unlike even the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, the PLA, the Chinese military, seems uninterested in putting guardrails in place, standard operating procedures. What happens if there's an accident between our ships in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere? If one of those sorties that the Chinese are sending every day into Taiwanese controlled airspace has an accident, it's a dangerous situation that could quickly spiral out of control. And when you hear our military leaders talking about this stuff, the space, anti-satellite, hypersonic, nuclear capable missiles are really a game changer. There are dramatic ambitions that the Chinese have on the nuclear side, building 1,000 systems over the next decade without real thought to how that changes the nuclear strategic balance. And just to reiterate, no real interest on the Chinese side about deconflicting and avoiding confrontation. And that, I think, is the most dangerous part. Again, not the Biden administration's fault. I know they're working on it very hard, but the strategy 1 year in is difficult to implement.
Great, thanks, Anja. Very, very interesting. So before we get into more specific topics, let me just put out a quick note to our audience. We will be doing Q&A starting in about 20 minutes or so, but you can put in your questions anytime. You don't have to wait. There is a Q&A link on your screen, so you can send in your questions. So Wendy, let's pick up on one of the topics that you raised, the CPTPP. Maybe you should explain what that is and the current status, although I'm sure most of our audience is familiar. How serious is China's application to join? Given China's state-led economy, can Beijing ever adhere to CPTPP rules? What would it take for Washington to rejoin it? And why aren't we even trying?
How much time do I have? So let me just answer this in a few minutes, but you put a lot of good questions on the table. In short, I think China's formal application that it put forward last fall to join the CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, basically without the United States, among 11 other countries with some minor adjustments. I think their bid is very serious, and I think it's something that the United States has to take very seriously. And when I look forward in the region, I do not think it is inconceivable that a year from now, if Margaret holds the same conference, that we may be talking about China's negotiations by China in the CPTPP to join. Now, look, if you look at the existing rules of the CPTPP, most of them shaped initially and proposed by the United States, China's existing trade and investment regime is nowhere near, those obligations. And frankly, in many areas, I would argue China's going in the opposite direction. They're getting even further away from being able to live up to the obligations. So whether it be the chapters on labor, on digital trade, on state-owned enterprises, on IPR, China is not there now. But I caution anyone who then, says, okay, the discussion's over. They'll never be able to join. I think that's the wrong way to look at this application. I think China's been thinking about putting its bid on the table for a long time. I think that it is serious about joining, but the end game is important. But also the game of getting in on the front end, which in CPTPP parlance would mean the actual start of CPTPP negotiations, and that's when the 11 parties would agree to set up a working group, would be a game changer. Getting their nose under the tent of this agreement, even if they're negotiating accession, I think will have enormous implications on the agreement. We'll have to see how things play out. The CPTPP, while it has accession rules, they have not been tested yet. The United Kingdom is the first country that has applied to the CPTPP. It is now in formal negotiations to join. The existing members have not agreed to set up a working group for China yet. They're still considering not only China's bid, but Taiwan's bid that came just a few days after. And so this is getting kind of very complicated for the existing CPTPP membership. And I would just conclude and say that I think different CPTPP members are going to have different views on China's accession. Some, like Japan and Australia, at least for now, I think are going to be pretty hardline and strict about conditions for China to enter, while others like Singapore and Malaysia may see this as a real opportunity to help push for reform and market opening in China. And so I think there are going to be a lot of conversations among the 11 members, and to go forward with anything, the consensus rule dictates any decisions in the CPTPP, which means any one country can block everything. And so, this is going to be, I think, just a very interesting saga to watch, one that I think is going to be a game changer in the region. And I think just underscores the need for the United States to get economically engaged in the region, even if it is not prepared nor interested in joining CPTPP at this moment, or maybe ever.
Yeah, it's ironic to say the least that China could conceivably get into the CPTPP before we do, since we were the original driver, and one of the original rationales was to balance China's growing economic influence in the region through this regional agreement. So it's
the irony of all ironies, and one that who could have ever predicted it?
Yeah, exactly. Anja or Deborah, you want to add anything on this topic before we move on?
I would add to one that the timing of China's application was important because it was right after AUKUS, and clearly they have viewed these regional trade agreements as the path forward for counterbalancing some of the alliances that the United States is building up, especially on the security side. And so not only obviously are they in CPTPP or applying, they just are part of RCEP, which was just announced as the largest regional trade agreement that includes many of the CPTPP members. What didn't get much headlines, but recently, I think it was last week, a group of ministers from the Gulf countries were in China, and they've agreed on the framework for a free trade agreement with the Gulf. There are discussions going on free trade agreements with Japan and Korea. The investment agreement with the EU is still out there, and at some point that's likely to start to move forward again. And we're seeing many others of these. And so while the US is still thinking about what its trade policy is going to be, the Chinese aren't waiting for us. They're actively out there negotiating these regional agreements, at the same time pushing for some reform of the WTO.
Yeah, I would just add, I think unfortunately, we have an unholy alliance of protectionism between Republicans and Democrats in the US, and it has really stymied the Biden administration's trade policy. I mean, poor Catherine Tai. What an impossible job to hold at this particular time. And those of us, as all of you do, I know, who travel around Asia, you keep hearing the same trope over and over again. We want to be a security partner of the United States, but we want to continue to be an economic partner of China. And I always think, okay, that's nice. So everyone's free riding on our security umbrella. And we're not opting into these agreements, which would help us economically and frankly, shore up everything we need to be doing in the Asia Pacific. But that's where we are politically.
That's where we are. Great. I want to just switch gears to a topic that's of considerable interest to me anyway, and hopefully to others. So Deborah, maybe I can ask you, we have had a number of high-level dialogues with China going back 30 years, really. The SED, about 15 years ago, the SNED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, the JCCT, which actually goes back to the 1980s. I believe you were involved with the creation of the SED with former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson back in 2006. Were these dialogues successful? Were they useful? Do we need a dialogue like that now?
Well, I think that I would say it's probably a very mixed bag on the success of the dialogues. One of the reasons that we created the SED, not the ampersand one, then going into the Obama administration, was there were really two reasons. One, it was a means to bring under one umbrella the over 100 bilateral economic dialogues that were going on with China at the time, and see if there was a way to start to prioritize those, because often a cabinet secretary would go to China and say, my issue is the most important one, and how we could start to make sure that there was coordination interagency, but at the same time to do it at a high level so that we could work within the way that the Chinese decision-making process worked. When we were at USTR doing trade negotiations with China, we could work our way up to our bosses, but our counterparts couldn't do anything until their bosses told them, here's what you can do. And it became a very frustrating process to try and get anything done. Are they useful? I think at this time, particularly now when we're facing tensions, it's important that you have some level of trust and some ability to have a discussion with your counterparts, even if it is not around going to lead each time you meet to a specific agenda. The SED was part of an overall China strategy. It wasn't a standalone, let's have a dialogue so that we can all get together and talk. But the challenge when you start putting these together is that it becomes the expectation that there would be a deliverable each time. And that wasn't really the intent of this one. The goal was to actually have a dialogue to look at longer term issues and to build the relationships. Hank Paulson would argue, of course, that it was very successful because when the financial crisis hit, he could pick up the phone and call his counterpart, who was Wang Qishan at the time, anytime, day or night. And he felt the confidence that they had built with the financial and economic team led to China actually being a stalwart during the financial crisis, actually didn't devalue their currency and started a stimulus program that actually pulled the rest of the world out of the recession. Whether some of these other dialogues were successful or not, I think when it became the SNED, it did become a little cumbersome, and it split the dialogue into two, and no longer were you dealing with the right structure within China. And so the climate change discussion was going on with Yang Jiechi, the foreign ministry counterpart, who had no control over climate change. So it was just a little bit of a disparity to actually try and get decisions made then with that new structure within the China system.
Thanks. Anja or Wendy?
Yeah, can I just add one point? There's always a lot of discussions around whether bilateral dialogues are successful, and we measure them in terms of what has actually been accomplished. Of course, that's important. But sometimes what Deborah mentioned is the most important part, is that you build the relationships between the senior level officials so that you can pick up the phone when things are really hard. And right now in the US-China relationship, I think that's one of the most worrying signs, that our best interlocutors on the Chinese side seem to have less power in the current power structure. You know, Wang Qishan, Liu He, folks that everyone dealt with across different US administrations and could see as an honest broker on the Chinese side, are less influential now. And just to reiterate the point I made before, Xi Jinping is really surrounded by a lot of people who don't like to interact with the US and the West. And so these dialogues just aren't happening at the highest government level, all the way down to, you know, dialogues that the Asia Society used to do, that the National Committee on US-China Relations used to do, that, you know, we are all veterans of hundreds of these, and they're almost all stopped. And I think that makes the relationship very dangerous.
Yeah, I personally was involved in all three of these dialogues that we mentioned, and I agree with you. I think the relationship building is as important, if not more important, than the so-called deliverables that we achieved. Wendy, anything to add on this?
Yeah, a bit of a contrary view. Now, I got involved in these dialogues kind of towards the end of their existence. And I have to say, they were some of the most painful meetings I've ever sat through.
No one said they were fun.
but very formal, really not accomplishing anything. We were focused on deliverables. There was a view that China was viewed on just delaying and detracting attention from, you know, key issues. Very formal, way too many people, and really just became less and less useful and valuable over time. Now, I'm a big promoter of communication and of building relationships and building trust. But I don't think you need these big dialogues, particularly with China, involving lots and lots of people to kind of to achieve that objective. So I think, you know, again, I'm not going to dispute that, you know, that they may have been useful at one point, they may have been useful in some issues. I think what we may see going forward are just for kind of very issue-specific engagement under the radar screen, you know, focused on a very, you know, concrete problem or common challenge versus a dialogue that has lots of issues on the table, lots of different folks at, you know, very senior levels, but also working levels from you know, from both sides.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. They were pretty painful, and particularly as it went along, they became more so. But a lot of good work was done on the margins of the actual formal sessions directly with counterparts. So I think that was quite useful. Okay, Anja, let me ask you on a different topic, which also has been touched on briefly. But last month, Secretary Blinken said in a speech in Jakarta, "We'll adopt a strategy that more closely weaves together all of our instruments of national power, diplomacy, military intelligence, with those of our allies and partners." What's your view of the administration's multilateral approach towards China, like the Quad, for example? Is this the right way to go? Is the administration likely to succeed in getting allies on board with our policy towards China?
Yeah, I think the administration has done a really excellent job shoring up our alliances, and it was necessary because they were quite damaged under the Trump administration. The Quad is a unique beast. You know, when I served in the State Department now over a decade ago, we were very hesitant to do anything with the Quad for fear of antagonizing China. Boy, how the world has changed. And, you know, it's bipartisan. Obama did a lot. Trump continued it. Biden is continuing it. And I think it's been quite a successful grouping for what it is. It's not going to be a formal military alliance, at least not involving India. And I think the approach will continue to be modular with all of our allies and partners in the region, which is important and flexible. So, for example, with India specifically, you know, we're finding it's an open door when you talk about security issues with India, because they're quite worried about what's going on with their long Himalayan border between India and China. Much harder once you start talking about economics, trade with the Indians, even technology and privacy standards, but there's some movement. I think there are three important things that the Quad has done in its most recent meeting. Cybersecurity, they created a cyber group, a senior cyber group, really focused on how do we share more information with each other? How do we develop secure software, really working level stuff, which is important. There's a semiconductor supply chain initiative. So the idea here is we don't need all parts of the semiconductor chain for each country, but maybe together we should have a good ecosystem. And then 5G deployment, there's a like track 1.5 dialogue that's being facilitated by the Open RAN Institute that talks about kind of new standards for all of these important things that are going to run the rails of everything you do on the modern economy. So those are some they're really under the radar, like no one writes about this stuff, but those are some pretty important nuanced developments in the Quad. And then I'll just say one thing. There's just been a sea change in how the Europeans view China. You know, 1.5 years, 2 years ago, right before COVID, 2 years ago, I remember being in meetings with Europeans with the sort of the most China hawkish folks. And, you know, the investment partnership that Deborah mentioned had just passed. People were just very sanguine about China. And they sort of thought Trump was crazy to be so hardline. Boy, how the world has changed. You know, you now have some European partners supporting us militarily in the South China Sea. And when you talk to capitals in Europe, even the Germans who've been most pro-China, there's a real concern about the direction in which Xi Jinping is taking China, and more openness to talking about investment restrictions, possibly even joint export controls, and all of the things that the US has been hammering on. So I would give the Biden administration a really solid grade on alliances.
Okay. Thank you. Wendy or Deborah, anything to add on this one?
I mean, I would agree with what Anja said. I would also just say is working with allies and partners is hard work, okay? I mean, many of our viewers might think, oh, they're your partners, they're our allies, we all have the same view. This is great. For someone who's, you know, during my career had to work in a lot of these different channels, it is hard. And you'll find that even if you share the same concerns, you not all the time support the same response or the same actions to take. And so therefore, we've seen the Biden administration, I think very skillfully, using different groupings of countries with respect to pursuing different issues. You know, under the UK's leadership in the G7, for example, we have seen, you know, a lot of outcry from those countries with respect to certain Chinese actions on Hong Kong and Xinjiang and elsewhere. Anja mentioned the Quad. The administration has also set up the Trade and Technology Council with Europe, with 10 working groups looking at a lot of the issues, overlap of issues, what the Quad is looking at, and just other fora as well, including ad hoc groupings and bilateral strategies as well. So I think we're going to see more and more of that going forward over the next 3 years, because it's not always the same group of countries that are going to rally behind our views and the actions we want to take on each issue. So I think being very nimble is very important. And I think the Biden administration gets an A on that front.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And I just would add one thing going back to kind of where I started. If you look at supporting Anja's point, the changing image, just those statistics around now how Chinese business is perceived in a lot of these different markets, it's very interesting and often viewed as not completely separate from the government, right? And so concerns about not only their business practices, but what their intentions are continuing to grow in a lot of these markets. And I think countries, whether it's across Europe, but even some countries where the US businesses and certainly US security interests have tended to dominate, whether it's the Middle East or Latin America, we're increasingly seeing Chinese companies going in there. We're increasingly then seeing foreign policy interest follow. And while they may not be activists yet in those markets, that's going to follow at some point because they're going to protect those growing economic interests. And so the US needs to be thinking ahead, not only bilaterally and with our major allies, but in many of these third country markets that we've seen with Southeast Asia, but also the Middle East and Latin America.
Great. I have several more topics that I'd like to get to, but we're getting lots of good questions from the audience. So let's switch gears for a bit and field some of those. So Anja, we have two related questions responding to your comment about the PLA and guardrails. So one says, why do you think the PLA is not interested in guardrails? And is there a voice within China that's calling for guardrails, if not de-escalation? And then there's another question related, which says, do you ascribe the non-collaborative attitude of the PLA on creating guardrails to itself or reflecting President Xi?
Yeah, boy, it's such a good question. And I don't really have an answer. You know, when I talk to our military leaders about this issue, you always get close, and each, you know, commander of Indo-PACOM has their own attempts, and our, you know, service secretaries have their own attempts, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is over there all the time. And it's just been complicated. And no one really understands why. It could be that culturally, that's not how the PLA works. You know, whereas our military is in place to defend the Constitution of the United States. The Chinese military exists to defend the Communist Party of China. And of course, Xi Jinping leads all of the military working groups. So whereas in previous Chinese administrations, you could sometimes think, maybe the PLA is going around the leader. Like there's a very famous example where Bob Gates, now my business partner, when he was Secretary of Defense, went over there and the Chinese rolled out a new bomber. And it was pretty clear that Hu Jintao didn't know that was going to happen. You cannot imagine that kind of thing happening now. I think Xi Jinping has much tighter control over the PLA. But honestly, it's a real mystery why they wouldn't just want to create standard operating procedures to de-escalate things if there's an accident.
Great. So here's a very interesting question, kind of a tricky one, but I think it's worth taking on. The JSH writes, it seems to me that the US is the one changing the long existing status quo across the Taiwan Straits by sending high-level US officials to Taiwan, US military for training the Taiwan military, treating Taiwan as an independent country in essence, if not in name. China's response has been defensive in response to this. Why is China cast as the bad guy? Anyone like to take that on?
I'm happy to take it, but others can chime in. I think there's a little bit of merit to that argument. You know, it's a little bit like a messy divorce where everybody says you started it. Clearly, Xi Jinping's speeches on Taiwan have been more aggressive than the speeches of his predecessors. He says in almost every speech, reunification with Taiwan is a priority, and then as an afterthought, peaceful reunification, right? And the sense you sort of get is, you know, if we can do it peacefully, great, but if not, then not. It is also true that many folks, especially in Congress, and aren't so steeped in the history of the really complicated history of China, Taiwan, and all the agreements and what they specifically say. And I do think we're marching pretty close to the line, partly because we don't want to see what happened to Hong Kong happen to Taiwan, and partly because people don't understand the history and aren't very careful. But I don't know, Wendy, Deborah, do you want to chime in on that?
I just think part of it too goes back to what the intention is, because when I was at the National Security Council, I was there in 1991, we were rebuilding the relationship after Tiananmen. And part of what we did was to balance out restarting cabinet level trips to China with sending the then USTR to Taiwan. We sold the F-16s to Taiwan, and we were returning some of the military aircraft that we had actually seized that was in the United States at the time of Tiananmen. And so there was not viewed, though, that the United States was moving towards recognition of Taiwan as a separate country. And I think that underlying concern perhaps in China is that's the direction that these actions are going in. And so where do they feel that they draw the line?
Oops, I just lost my question there. Sorry, hold on just one second. Okay, so here's an interesting question. It seems that one of the key impediments to resetting US-China relations is the anti-US, anti-China stance in the respective countries. If so, then what are the possibilities of either overcoming or bringing about some change, no matter how slight, to these perspectives?
I'm happy to talk about that. I would say one of the issues that we haven't really touched upon is climate change. And Anja mentioned it a little bit in terms of Glasgow, but it's been identified as one of those areas of potential cooperation between the United States and China. And a lot of what we have found in the years when we have been through these ups and downs, and while certainly we're in a down, it does seem that both presidents have agreed to basically manage a floor in the relationship at this point. We still have the tensions, but we're not seeing these kinds of up and down swings that we had been previously. Clearly, climate is an area that both countries are concerned about. Xi Jinping has made a lot of stands. He has a political, economic, and sort of social imperative for some of the actions that he has to take around climate, and Biden has made this an all-of-government opportunity, and building some of those. If we can get a few wins in this space, it does help to build some confidence and some positive momentum to perhaps tackle some of the more complicated issues. It also gives the administration, if it's handled right, some opportunities and political cover for taking some of the other positive actions that they might want to take. My only concern as I look ahead, though, in climate is around technology. And I know Anja probably has a lot of thoughts about this, but climate technology in the Chinese market for environmental goods and services is about a $16 trillion opportunity over the next decade. And it's going to be a lot of the testing grounds for a lot of these new environmental goods and services. And it's where China is seeking to dominate. And we already see that right in solar panels. We see it in new energy vehicles. We see it in lithium ion batteries. This could, if we don't create this right kind of framework, end up an area where we have a competitive clash as well.
If I can just add to that, to the question, the overall question, just kind of building on something that Deborah said, I think the question is presents a very a probing question, because both sides are really their domestic audiences are really pressing for be tough. Don't give any ground, don't be soft, don't make any concessions. And so that doesn't help to kind of reset a relationship. I mean, my view and my experience when relationships with other countries get to this kind of low, you need to keep your expectations very low, take baby steps, a lot of times under the radar, and just see, slowly, see if you can get things done. And I think we are seeing some of that stuff going on with China now. I mean, I would note on trade, since Ambassador Tai has given her speech on, re-engaging with China in October, we haven't heard anything from USTR, but we know they're continuing to talk to their Chinese counterparts. Now, whether they're going to be able to, find some common ground with respect to how to address China's shortcomings in the phase 1 agreement remains to be seen. But again, there is dialogue going on there. I noticed just the other day when China stopped US planes going into China, largely for COVID reasons, both sides are talking. Climate change is another area where, a bilateral group was established. I know Anja's already touched on that, and maybe it was space saving, but it still represents some bilateral engagement. And I think there may be other areas under the radar where these kind of baby steps may be taken. But I think that's the way we need to look at any progress. I think we've got to keep our expectations just very low. And focus on some low-hanging fruit. And even low-hanging fruit, as we've seen, is not easy, because many of us predicted that by now, within a year into the Biden administration, for example, the 2 consulates that were closed in Chengdu and Houston would have been reopened by now, and they haven't. So, is that low-hanging fruit? I guess not.
Right. Things we thought were low-hanging fruit actually aren't. Ira, can I add one point?
Sure.
Because I think implicit in the question about hard lines from both sides domestically, let's not draw a false parallel here. In China, there's one channel. Whether you're on WeChat or whether you're watching any Chinese news source, even the ones that were a little bit more independent, like Caixin and others, have been reeled in. So all you hear is anti-American propaganda, and America is in decline, and on and on and on. My few friends who are expats who are still there, they're being fed a constant diet of this. in the United States, it is true that public sentiment has turned against China. And it is also true that it's politically convenient, especially for members of Congress. You know, it's always an applause line to say something tough on China. But there are other debates, you know, like the Asia Society. All of us have conferences like this where we openly discuss different approaches towards China, and that's not happening on the Chinese side. And just one last sentence on Taiwan that I forgot to mention. I think, yes, there may be a little bit of overreach by some US officials, especially members of Congress. However, does anyone believe that if the US pulled back entirely and didn't do any of these things to support Taiwan, that mainland China would change its stance and would moderate it? I'm not so sure.
So let me continue with you, Anja. The topic of technology has been touched on briefly, and I know that's something that you have a lot of thoughts on. We have a quick question here. In terms of recoupling with US business and China, how does US technology fit in or not in that trend? And maybe you can also just talk a bit about the technology race between the US and China more generally, what's going on there.
Sure. Much has been made about decoupling. I see it as a range. In consumer products, American companies are still doing quite well in China. Then you get towards financial services. The Chinese are certainly rolling out the red carpet there. Who knows how long it'll last. Then you get all the way over to technology, where really the race and the competition is joined. And it's become, over the last few years, really hard. We tend to define that very broadly as all technology. And Deborah just reminded us that maybe on clean tech and some other things, there are lots of areas where the US and China should actually be collaborating, and it would be helpful for the world. Certainly in lots of areas of basic science, it's important for the world to continue to collaborate. So I'm not a fan of complete decoupling. But I would say there are 5 or so big areas of technology where both China and the US and our friends and partners now believe that it's more of a race and we need to stay ahead of the game. And I would say that's semiconductors, because of course those chips are the building blocks of everything else we do in IT. Artificial intelligence, because it's such a broad technology that it's like electricity, it's multi-purpose. It's going to start being infused into empowering everything else. 5G and 6G, those are our communication networks that are going to run not just the phones you're currently on and the device on which you're watching this Zoom, but self-driving cars and the Internet of Things. So that's critical. Some parts of biotechnology, but not all of it. And then financial technology, which we talk about much less, but the West has so dominated the financial system that that's actually how we implement our sanctions around the world. And, you know, China is really good, I would say, ahead of us on a lot of fintech and payment systems. And soon we won't be able to implement our sanctions the way we have in the past. So those are kind of the areas of technology where I think the race is joined. And maybe I'll just stop there, but happy to talk more about how the decoupling is progressing and what we might do about it.
Okay, let me switch gears. I think we would be remiss if we don't at least touch on the issue of human rights. And we have a question here. What, if anything, can be done about the dramatic changes in China's treatment of Hong Kong? And isn't the stepped up suppression of human rights under Xi part of the reason for the increased tensions with the West? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Wendy? No one wants to talk human rights?
It's a tough subject.
It's a tough subject. I'll just say something. It is definitely one, as we look at many of the issues ahead that the American business community has to face in its continuing relationship, not just with China, but doing business in Hong Kong, where we have been very active. Clearly, and I'm not putting aside the ethics, I'm putting aside the ethics of this, which clearly are wrong. The United States and our companies stand for certain values. The administration and Secretary Blinken have made very clear an expectation that American companies should reflect their values and American values in any market where it's operating. But it certainly, from a business perspective, has become one of the largest kind of regulatory or issue risks that they have to face, both in the US, but as Anja and Wendy have both said, increasingly in Europe and other countries.
Maybe I can just add to that. I also think that it's shareholders of these companies too that are putting a lot of pressure on American companies. Their ability to kind of straddle both systems, I think, is really coming to a head. And just this past few weeks, we've seen Intel and Walmart being called out in China. Two companies that were kind of, at least in my days, some of the poster child investors in China. And so I think it's just going to be a really rocky road for US companies operating and trading with China going forward. I think the competing regulatory environments are going to put a lot of pressure on companies. And obviously the latest legislation from coming out of the United States that Biden signed a few weeks ago with respect to basically, no forced labor in your supply chains. And if, we're going to ban all imports from Xinjiang unless you can affirmatively, as a U.S. company, show that that no forced labor was used anywhere in the supply chain. And wow, is that a high bar for companies, to meet? We haven't, I think we touched upon in the beginning, and I know our time's coming to a close, but, when I look ahead for the next 3 years, I do think that we're going to see a continued gap between where the administration is going on China and, where at least certain parts of the business community are. And I think they're very different views on China. I think Deborah early on, I think eloquently put forward a lot of views of business, but I can tell you from at least folks I talked to in the administration, there's a real suspicion of U.S. companies and a sense that, they're there to make money and they'll make money. They want to make money and want to make profits no matter what. They're not taking seriously the kind of threats that China, that China poses. And if we don't act now, and if we're not tough, and if we don't have sanctions in place, then we're going to find ourselves in a very different position in 10 or 20 years. And I just see that gap just widening, and not just between like Wall Street and and the administration. I think a lot of big multinationals and corporations, and I think we're going to just see that gap increasing. And, maybe the administration even reaching out less and less to the business community for input and advice going forward. And I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, and I'd be interested in what Anja and Deborah have to say here, but at least from Washington, that's just, my perspective.
Yeah.
And if I can just add one thing before you go ahead, that I've seen estimates that for US businesses have a rule of thumb that China makes up half of global demand for most products, and that China will account for a third to half of expected growth over the next decade. So you can see the enormous importance of the China market to US companies over the next years. And balancing that with the increased pressure that we've been talking about on the human rights side, it's going to be a more and more delicate balance for companies going forward.
Yep, that's exactly right. I think this is a great topic for us to end on, because there's so many business folks, I think, in the audience here. It's not going to be business as usual with China. I do think, Wendy, you're right that I would hope there would be more consultations between the American business community and the administration, because most of the business leaders that I talk to actually really want to do the right thing. They're not totally profit driven. They don't want forced labor in their supply chains. It's hard to figure out exactly where it is and what it is and what's going on. And I would say one other thing. If our goal as the United States and our friends and allies is to remain competitive and to remain vibrant societies and to have strong economies and to remain ahead in the technology race, especially in those technologies I talked about, some interaction with China as the world's biggest market is going to be important. I'll just give you an example of our semiconductor companies. It's very difficult for them even to send right now the 1990s era technology. That's totally out there. There's lots of people that can substitute. If Americans aren't selling, then somebody from Korea or Taiwan or the Netherlands or elsewhere will. and selling that less advanced technology to China actually funds the advanced R&D to keep American companies in the lead. So I think sometimes these issues are more nuanced than they're written about in the press and certainly discussed in Washington. And that's not to be an apologist for US business, but it's just for the administration to think through, what's our goal here? Is it to shut China out, or is it to stay ahead? And if it's to stay ahead, then slightly different and more nuanced policies follow from that.
And I agree with Anja too. I think that this is an area where the business community and the administration need to work very closely together, because I agree, in most cases, most American companies want to do the right thing. And they're going to balance that, though, with how we remain competitive at home. And if we're simply closing the China market to American companies while their competitors in Europe and other parts can go in, are we really accomplishing the goals that we were hoping from a national security or human rights or another perspective? And so how do we come up? And it's no question, it's complicated. And China isn't as easy to deal with as it was 20 years ago. How do we find those right ways forward? And we're going to have to be thinking about new kinds of tools, new tools in trade that we can deploy, new tools in national security, new types of export controls, and, as Wendy said, new alliances.
If I can just clarify, I was not advocating, this anti-business, stance. I was just trying to share, a perspective that concerns me. And I couldn't agree more with Anja. And maybe I'd come back to something I said in the beginning, and that is that, the administration, when it's making policy, it's doing it in a much more deliberate way and is inviting more input. I think under the Trump administration, businesses were really not even brought in on a lot of these really kind of technical export control entity list issues. And there seems to be more of a dialogue. And I think that business input is really important as sanctions or other measures are developed, because you don't want to end up shooting yourself in the foot. And I think that's what you were getting at, Anja. Even if a tough measure looks good for today, what are the implications? What are the medium and long-term costs of this? So just want to put that on the table before we wrap up.
And they must be multilateral, because there's no point in us not being able to sell if everyone else can.
Our thanks to Ira, Wendy, Anja, and Deborah. You raised a number of important topics that we'll continue to follow and maybe even include at our conference next year. So thanks for that. There were a lot of audience questions on business and tech, and we have sessions coming up on those topics later this afternoon.